They held the funeral on the second day, with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers, with the crayon face of her father musing profoundly above the bier, and the ladies sibilant and macabre, and the very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms, on the porch and the lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her perhaps, confusing time with its mathematical progression, as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but, instead, a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decade of years. William Faulkner's A Rose for Emily, written in 1930, defies much of the conventional wisdom about crafting an effective and affecting narrative. Its scope and structure is broad and sweeping, covering at times short bursts of days and at others decade-long swaths of history. Its tone is simultaneously dark and wryly conversational. It's arguable if the narrative even has a central protagonist, but if the titular Emily Grierson qualifies, then she certainly isn't the traditional dynamic character. Indeed, perhaps Emily's defining trait is her lack of an arc, her resistance towards change. All this is related through Faulkner's ever-present narrator, unfolding a narrative which is, as the initial quote suggests, deeply concerned with time. Ultimately, this preoccupation with time and this unfolding of a narrative driven by a unique perspective, the challenge posed by the continual progression of time, and the struggle to resist change by those dissatisfied with its effects, is what sits at the dark heart of Faulkner's narrative. Faulkner employs a range of narrative techniques, but the quality of storytelling which is perhaps most instrumental in developing his message about time is narration and perspective, which Faulkner masterfully employs in order to shape the structure, tone, and the titular character of Emily. The narrator unspools Emily's story like a thread of gossip, in a rambling, fluid framework marked by rapid shifts in time and extended tangents as topics emerge. Faulkner's narrator mimics the perspective of a citizen of Jefferson, structuring the tale around a series of notable events and situating the overarching story in constant relation to the past. In this way, the structure and narration of the narrative support the core ideas about time. The narrative's content deals with the relationship between the past and the present, and the struggle to situate oneself between them, and the shape of the story itself similarly engages with this dynamic, shifting between present and past smoothly, forcing readers to continually navigate this tension. The narrative unfolds in 5 sections, each supporting and contextualizing the others. Part 1 introduces the concept of Emily's death, then moves backward an indeterminate amount of time to establish the town's perennial attempts to get her to pay taxes and Emily's insistence that she has an agreement with the long-dead mayor. Part 2 moves a further 30 years back to discuss an incident in which a strong odor came from Emily's house and refers to a period 2 years prior to that in which her father died. Part 3 returns to a time roughly contemporary to these incidents to describe Emily's relationship with a northern businessman named Homer Barron, and relates a curious incident in which Emily bought poison. Part 4 briefly reiterates the apparent courtship between Emily and Homer, and the apparent jilting which she received upon his sudden disappearance, and then rapidly progresses over the course of decades to arrive back at her death. The final section, Section 5, takes place over the comparatively small span of a couple days, from Emily's funeral to the opening of her house and the final grisly discovery which ties these seemingly disparate plot threads together. Absent in this telling is the measured, ordered progression of plot which more traditional short stories may follow. While these elements exist independently in the narrative, the story eschews a traditional organization in favor of a narration that mimics the voice and point of view of an ordinary Jefferson citizen. The story's 5 sections cover periods ranging from a matter of days to stretches of decades, ambling through the history of both Emily and her notoriety to the town as topics arise. The result is a conversational narrative, which unfolds as if a first-hand witness were recounting the story and sharing the latest gossip on such a local legend. Faulkner's narrator positions us as external observers, ourselves townsfolk of Jefferson, building a narrative from pieces of gossip and second-hand details, which only attain significance much later. By crafting a point of view that places us into the world of the story in this way, Faulkner forces the reader to navigate the same complex interrelationship of past and present, tradition and progress, from which Emily violently revolts. The past is ever present in Jefferson, and it falls to us to make sense of its implications. Another function of the point of view employed by Faulkner is to establish the dark, foreboding tone which so distinctly marks both naturalist and Southern Gothic literature. The creeping sense of horror and discomfort present in the narrator's perspective creates this Gothic atmosphere and pervades the work with a sense of unease, while also allowing foreshadowing of key details for the reader under cover of digression. When the narrator casually mentions a close, dank smell in Emily's home, remarks offhand about the shape of her skeleton and her corpse like appearance, or makes passing reference to the public perception of Emily as crazy, it's easy to dismiss these as colorful additions on behalf of a chatty neighbor relating gossip. Yet remarks like these take on sinister new implications in light of the story's ending. What drove this severe but seemingly harmless woman to such macabre actions? Ultimately, Faulkner's choice to place a narrator on the periphery of Emily's actual experience limits our ability to understand her situation and places us in a position of judgment. Emily, as related by this narrator, is defined by a tension between past and present, as continually raised in the narration. At numerous points, the narrator positions Emily as locked into a kind of generational conflict, periodically encountering young contemporary leaders of Jefferson who attempt in their own way to force her to conform to more modern sensibilities, only for each to be met with the same stubborn refusal. Upon the death of her father, Emily initially refuses to acknowledge his passing, and only after a great deal of effort does she acquiesce to have him buried. Even her house is the last of its style, and she refuses even to allow the affixation of a postal address. Our narrator refers to Emily as variously a fallen monument, a hereditary obligation upon the town, a tradition, a duty, and a care, and ultimately dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. Ironically, or is it appropriately, the narrator is placed in a position far removed from Emily's actual experience, yet, as an avatar of the town, is in perpetual judgment of her. Emily navigates the space between public and private life, and is subject to the collective perceptions of the town who see her as long since past her time. For the narrator, and by extension the town of Jefferson, and perhaps even the reader, Emily embodies one of the most prominent elements of Southern Gothic literature, the bygone past, a world just out of reach, the consequences and impact of which is simultaneously inescapable and forever lost. For Emily, the past is, as Faulkner relates for other elder citizens of the town, not a diminishing road, but a huge meadow, an imminently attainable world which exists only faintly out of reach. She hopes to preserve it, to hold it in stasis forever, even as the rest of the town moves on and leaves her behind. In developing the narrator through this external, conversational perspective, Faulkner eschews a traditional structure, develops a tone that's appropriate and includes foreshadowing, and paints Emily through the lens of an outside viewer, showcasing this tendency for her to navigate past and present. This masterful development of point of view draws us into these seemingly small municipal struggles and makes each of us citizens of Jefferson, sharing gossip, discussing the local mainstays, and debating the behaviors and secrets of our fellow citizens. Some questions to consider in responding to A Rose for Emily. How does the point of view of Faulkner's narrator and the structure of the work create meaning in the narrative? What does Faulkner intend Emily to represent? Are her actions symbolic? How might we read the characters and their behaviors allegorically? To what extent do Emily's actions represent the madness that is ascribed throughout the narrative to her family, and to what extent is she able to influence or control her actions? What role does propriety and decorum play in the town of Jefferson? Is this decorum ultimately good or bad? Faulkner's narrator repeatedly expresses the town's pity for Emily. To what extent should readers echo that sentiment? Is Emily deserving of our sympathy? What significance should we read into some of the major motifs that Faulkner develops? Motifs such as time, tradition, family, dignity and honor, death, decay, and the secret lives that we each lead. How might Emily's story look if we read through an alternate lens? What would a feminist or Marxist critical reading of the story reveal, for example? And, of course, in your own reading, what do you think drives Emily to commit the heinous acts at the heart of the narrative, apparently murdering Homer Barron and sleeping beside his corpse?